Welcome, primary voters. I'm Elizabeth Benyon, Director of Voter Services and Education for the League of Women Voters of the South Bend area and Director of IU South Bend's American Democracy Project. This is our Vote 411 interview series with candidates running in contested primaries in your 2020 primary election for St. Joseph County, Indiana. Today, I am joined by Ellen Marks, who is running in Congressional District 2. Welcome, Ellen.
Hello.
I want to get right to the questions. A big issue that lots of people are thinking about, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, is the question of healthcare and access to healthcare. Where do you stand? What kind of system do you propose?
So I believe that everyone should have access to affordable healthcare. The question is how we get from where we are to there. Right now, I favor having a public option to buy into Medicare or a similar program. The way that I would see that work would be that it would not only be available to people who did not have employer-sponsored health insurance, but it would be set up so that employer-sponsored insurance could include facilitating the buy-in of employees into that government option. I think doing it that way increases the uptake of that type of program much more rapidly. It would make people have insurance that was much more portable if they lost their jobs or left their jobs. So I think that that's the best path forward. I would also very much support making sure that we're supporting hospitals and ensuring, especially in a time like this when they're dealing with so many unexpected costs and having such disruption of their revenue stream, we need to make sure that our hospitals stay strong through this, and that may well mean federal government support.
Thank you. I want to ask next about global trade. What role should free trade, fair trade, and tariffs play in thinking about the U.S. relations with other countries and what's best for our economy and the global economy?
So one of the things that we have seen very clearly over the past few years, and particularly over the past few months, is how tied in our economy is to the economies of other countries. So we know that everything from our supply chains to the markets for what's farmed in our local farms depends on what type of international trade relations we have. But it's complex, and it depends on a lot of different aspects of relationships between our countries. I think some of it depends on fairness of labor practices. So I don't really have a particularly strong ideological perspective that says, you know, we must have free trade or we must have closed borders. I think that we're part of a global economy. I think we need to honor and own that we are part of a global economy. And I think that we need to be participating in that economy in a way that is going to be smart in terms of our needs, in terms of the needs of the international community, in terms of the well-being of people here and across the world. And that plans for disasters like the ones that we have, where we do not find ourselves suddenly dependent for something essential on a country that has closed its borders.
I want to ask you next about the economy here in the United States. Many Democrats have expressed concerns about the growing gap between the wealthiest members of our society and the rest of the society, the middle class with stagnant wages and the poor and working class who haven't seen the kind of gains that those at the top of the income ladder have seen. Do you see this as a major issue? And if so, what, if anything, would you propose Congress do about it?
I think it's a very critical issue, and I think it's more so now, and more obviously so now than it's been at any time in recent memory. You know, we've seen the loss of, I believe, 36 million jobs in a couple of months because of the pandemic. The University of Chicago thinks that about 42% of those will not come back. But we already had people who were struggling. We know that low unemployment and a good stock market do not transition into prosperity for a large part of our country, especially the people who are, as it turns out, essential workers. So we really need to be doing more in terms of making sure that we're taking care of everybody. Um, I think that some of our options include having higher tax rates at the very top of the income scale. Um, I think it also includes um, having a more robust safety net, having a higher minimum wage, which I think we should put in the hands of cities and districts to determine based on their own costs of living, probably with some sort of floor. Uh, so I think that it is very important that we support labor unions and labor organizations and collective bargaining rights, because we know that individually employees have no power, but collectively they can make real differences, and get to a level of treatment that reflects the importance of them to an organization in the aggregate. So those would be some of the ways that I would look at it.
The next topic I wanted to ask you about is the topic of guns. Americans, of course, value civil liberties, but also public safety and their own safety. What proposals would you try to push forward as a member of Congress in terms of gun ownership, gun control, and gun safety? Are there any changes you would like to see to federal law?
You know, there are a lot of changes I would like to see to federal law in terms of having stricter rules around keeping keeping guns out of the hands of people who have been known to abuse them. I don't think that there's any reason for people to be able to easily buy high capacity magazines, or, you know, semi-automatic assault weapons. I also think that dealing with gun issues is something that has to have support within the community. So one thing that I would very much want to do would be to fund some of the organizations that are working on the ground to change the way that people think about and use guns. One of the only pieces of jewelry that I wear is this bracelet, which I got from Bullets for Life, which is an organization here in South Bend that takes bullets off the street and turns them into jewelry, but also provides counseling to young people who are at risk of gun violence and are at risk of perpetrating gun violence. And I'm particularly focused on that right now because the 17-year-old son of one of the founders of Bullets for Life was killed in gun violence last week, which is devastating to everybody who has been involved with that organization. And I think we need to do more in terms of giving people hope and a path in life that has real promise for them, so that the easy answer of guns doesn't feel so easy to them, because it sure isn't for anybody who gets left behind.
Another big issue nationally and internationally is climate change. How much of a threat do you think climate change is? And what do you propose in terms of reduction of carbon pollution and also preparing for the effects of climate change?
I think that climate change is the biggest threat that we have just refused for decades to deal with, and we've run out of time. So we absolutely need to deal with global climate change. We need to be dramatically reducing our carbon emissions. My feeling on that is that we need to be smart about how we do it. One of the things that I think always hurts Democrats when we talk about addressing the threat of climate change is that people focus on the likelihood that they will be asked to give up something that they value, some critical, fantastic part of their lives. And I don't think we need to do it that way. You know, one of the things that would cause significant changes fairly rapidly, and it's already underway, but we need to accelerate it, is investing in clean energy power generation. So if your electricity is generated by onshore wind or solar, not only is that better for your environment than coal generation, but it's also cheaper now because the technology has come so far so quickly. So one of the things that I'm excited about is the idea of having a national green bank, which would basically fill in the holes in capital structures so that people who were trying to build new clean energy generation facilities would be able to get the financing to build them very quickly. And with them would come terrific clean energy, high-paying jobs. What we've seen in other jurisdictions is that those jobs are overwhelmingly union jobs. They provide training. And once you do that, once you have the resiliency in our power generation, it makes things like electric cars much more of an option as well. And if we do it right, we do planning that includes making sure that we have charging facilities everywhere people are going to need them. So I think we can look at how we deal with climate change as something where we can strengthen the economy and create a lot of jobs and also get to a cleaner planet. Good for everyone.
Win-win solutions is certainly what people are looking for. One of the issues that we haven't been able to solve and seem to find a solution that everybody agrees to is immigration. Everybody seems to agree that the system is broken, whether they are liberals or conservatives, but we don't seem to agree on how to fix the system. So what changes would you like to see? Do we need a DREAM Act, a path to legalization, more border security, a bigger, better wall? Where do you stand?
Well, first of all, I completely support the Dreamers. I think that they are part of our country and we need to have a path for them to become permanently part of our country. I also think that we should have a path to citizenship for people who have lived here in many cases for decades and become part of their communities, but didn't come here with the right paperwork in hand. I also think that we just need to be much more thoughtful about how we approach our immigration laws. We have been mistreating refugees at our border in ways that I personally find horrifying for the last several years. One of the first things that I would do in Congress is introduce legislation to prevent the separation of children from their parents at the border. I think that it's essential that we do better by these kids wherever they come from and by their parents. But I also think that we need to have better pathways for people to immigrate here legally. And I think that we need to look at imposing consequences, not so much on immigrants who come here to take jobs illegally, but on the employers who choose to recruit people to come here illegally. We see a lot of stories about places where everybody has a wink and a nod about the fact that their staff is not legally here. And when you think about people who are just trying to provide for their families in a place where there is no path up and no hope, you can understand why walking across a border, even at significant risk to your life and your safety, would be attractive. But the people who are luring them over usually get off without any meaningful consequences. So I think if we make it harder for them to do that, it gives us much more of an opportunity to talk about, where the jobs are and where they should be, and how we get people here who really have something to offer and who value being part of this country.
As we think about people's safety, a big topic on people's minds right now, of course, is what our government is doing to protect us during this global pandemic. And I wonder how you would rate our national response, but also are there any specific policy proposals that you have in terms of dealing with the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19, or thinking forward toward any future health crises?
So one of the discussions that I keep having with some of my conservative friends is about why everybody is being a Monday morning quarterback about the federal government response to COVID-19. And I keep saying, it isn't Monday morning, we're in the first quarter. We're still very much in the middle of this crisis. We know that there were early missteps in terms of testing, in terms of what people were being told about whether masks would be helpful, in terms of even whether there was human to human transition that was possible. And we've absolutely seen the consequences of that in a country that really was unprepared for a pandemic when we should have been the most prepared country in the world. There is, in fact, federal legislation, I think it's called the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, which was intended to make sure that we were ready for something like this. And it didn't. So one of the things that I would very much want to do in Congress is to understand what went wrong with that act, why it didn't achieve what it was intended to, and how we go about fixing it so that we don't get caught by surprise with another crisis like this. I also think that one of the problems that we are having right now is that it has become so politically polarized as an issue, which it shouldn't be. It is a pandemic. We have a disease that didn't exist 6 months ago that has killed nearly 100,000 Americans. And instead of all of us coming together and saying, we are in this together, people are fighting about whether it really is a threat, whether it's worth it to just go out and live your life, whether wearing a mask, which we think could cut, somewhere between 60 and 85% of the transmission risk, is such an affront to personal liberty that it can't be done. And that's all being driven by the tone at the top. The White House is encouraging this to become a polarized issue, and it shouldn't be. We should all be in this together. And I believe that overwhelmingly Americans think that we are. We also just need to be doing more in terms of helping people who are financially harmed by this. You know, we've had so many jobs that have been ripped out from under people. We've had so many businesses that were thriving one day and shuttered the next because of nothing that anybody did. And we're not getting the money that's been allocated to help on those issues into the hands of the people who need it the most, and we're not getting it there fast enough. I think there's going to be much, much more that we're going to have to do. This is not going to just resolve itself. People aren't going to suddenly go back to hopping on airplanes without a second thought, or, you know, having even open air concerts with tens of thousands of people. Things that have been really important to our life are going to stay shuttered whether the government reopens or not. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're spreading the cost of that among all of us and not just imposing it on the people who were unlucky enough to be the most at risk of those economic consequences.
A stable democracy requires that people have some level of trust in government to help them in crises and make their lives better, but also some level of citizen participation in government. What would you suggest, particularly in the wake of this global pandemic, that we can do to get people more interested in participating, but also participating in a healthy way where they feel like they're working with the government and being listened to? What would you do as a member of Congress to try to facilitate this?
I think that there are a ton of people out there who have taken our democracy for granted and are trying to figure out a way to get involved, to make their voices heard, to be part of the process. I spent a lot of 2017 calling my legislators, sometimes in ways that felt like I was being heard, and a lot of time in ways where I felt that there was no one who cared at the other end, depending on which views I expressed. So I think that we need to have representatives who are going to be much better at listening to people who have views that they disagree with and trying to find common ground with them. You know, as a lawyer, a transactional lawyer, my job is to get to an agreement among people who have very different interests and potential economic outcomes and who have a tendency to talk past each other. But often what we find is that when we can stop everybody from getting outraged, we can have a conversation and find that we are not nearly as far apart as we thought we were. So one of the things I would do personally as a legislator is really work to listen to and talk to everyone, including the people who are going to yell at me and say terrible things. You know, it's part of the job. But you also find that there are real reasons that they're angry, and you need to understand what those are if you're going to be able to help make this country less polarized. And I think we can do that. I think that we need people who are in it to fix things, which is what I'm in for, if you're going to get there. I also think we need much stronger ethics rules in the House, in the Senate, in the White House. All of the conflicts of interest that people have and bring, and all of the ways that they make money off of information that they get from government or their contacts, we've got to stop that. So that would also be a key goal for me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. And voters, do not forget to mail in those primary ballots. And this will be the safest way to vote this particular primary season. There will be limited options for early voting and in-person voting. Make sure you bring your own PPE if you plan to do that. But we do encourage you to check out all the candidates on your ballot at vote411.org and make a decision about who will represent you best before mailing in your ballot. Thanks for being with us today, Ellen, and thank you for those who tuned in.